So you've got loads of people joining. It's one of those ones where you sort of like everything's off, the audio's off, the videos, okay. Well, the audio's on, but the videos are.
Welcome everyone that has joined already. We'll wait a couple of more minutes. In the meantime, can everyone please mute their microphones? Thank you. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Rosamunde van Brakel, and I would like to welcome you to the 4th VUB Chair in Surveillance Studies seminar series. I'm very excited to have Professor Kirstie Ball with us today, who will talk about workplace counter-surveillance. Kirstie is Professor of Management at St Andrews University in Scotland and co-director and co-founder of CRISP, which is the Centre for Research into Information, Surveillance and Privacy. CRISP is a joint research centre between St Andrews, Edinburgh, Stirling and Essex universities. Kirstie co-founded Surveillance and Society and the Surveillance Studies Network, an educational charity which supports the journal. She was director of the network and editor of the journal for many years. She has published and presented extensively on topics such as workplace surveillance and political economy of surveillance. Now, just a reminder to everyone, this seminar will be recorded and posted later online on YouTube. And I would like to ask you to refrain from putting anything in the chat until Kirstie has finished talking. And please, if you have questions, raise your hand or put your question in the chat. And I'm now very happy to welcome Kirstie Ball to talk about workplace counter-surveillance.
Thank you, Rosamund, and hi everybody. Good afternoon. What a lovely way to spend a Friday afternoon, thinking and talking about workplace surveillance. It's an honour to be part of the VUB seminar series, and today I'm going to be talking about some work that I've been doing for the project Kalim, which is a European research project focusing on collaborative economy and employment. And as part of that project, I've been asked to contribute to the surveys that this project has been doing on the size and shape and extent of the platform economy across Europe. And another thing they've asked me to do, which is I'm talking about today, is a systematic review of the intersection of the research on workplace surveillance in traditional workplaces with the kind of surveillance that's now going on in remote work and in platform work. And for me, this kind of represents a really welcome return to the topic of workplace surveillance. I've not really looked at it for maybe 5 or 6 years, but those who've known me for a long time will know that this is what I wrote my PhD on in the 1990s. So that is the talk today. So let me tell you a bit about the structure. So this quite clearly is the introduction, but I'll talk to you first of all about the systematic review itself, and then the results of that. It's turned into a huge piece of work. Actually, I wasn't expecting to be this big, but I want to give you a sense of the size of the piece of work and some of the rationales behind it. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about platform work, which is the topic of the talk. And I'm very aware that this audience is quite interdisciplinary, so there's going to be some elements of the talk that will be very familiar, others less familiar. So I'm going to kind of set out the terrain, which is platform work. Then I'm going to focus on compliance and resistance in platform work, particularly to algorithmic control. Now, this is a very major feature of the work. And then I'll be sharing with you some of my thoughts that arose when I was doing the research that made me really rethink aspects of workplace surveillance and some of the kind of common approaches that we have before drawing some conclusions. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So here comes the slide, which is about the systematic review method and its results. And I'll warn you, it's really busy, right? So here you go. Whoa. Okay, so the systematic review that I've been doing, as I said, was focused on the central question, which is to do with the intersection of traditional workplace surveillance with remote work and platform work. And this literature review has been designed in conjunction with the project team. And because I've been working in this area for a while, I'm aware of like certain meta-analyses that have gone before, and I'm actually aware of the work that goes right back to the 1980s. So the first stage of the systematic review was to really update that work on workplace surveillance. And you can see there that the search terms, which are in the blue boxes, were the ones that I applied in multiple combinations. Overall, there's nearly 400 articles now published on workplace surveillance, but 167 of those were new as a result of this search. And it's really important when you're studying workplace surveillance to be aware that the terms monitoring and surveillance refer to the same phenomenon, but they denote different kind of epistemological commitments and different kind of journals as well. So if you're writing about workplace monitoring, it's very likely that you're an occupational psychologist publishing in the psychology journals and also in the business journals. Whereas if you're writing on surveillance, it's very likely that you are a sociologist or a more critically inclined social scientist writing in the more critical journals. And it's important to bring those together. And the way I coded the results of the systematic review was using a framework I devised with a psychologist called Steve Margulis in a paper in 2011 that identified those interdisciplinary themes that this work fits under together. So that was the first stage of the systematic review. The second stage, as you can see, was enormous. What we were trying to do there on the project team was try to identify all the pseudonyms for platform work. As you can see there, we tried 16 different pseudonyms, all combined with surveillance and monitoring, and that produced a further 114 articles, and actually very few of them overlapped with the results of the first stage. There was a heavy skew towards surveillance, so there's a lot of critical work going on here, looking at platform work. And finally, we had like a single item search chain relating to some of the core aspects of platform work, just as almost like a bucket category to capture anything that was left. And that actually yielded 200 articles, but many of them were not relevant to surveillance. So that's what I'm in the middle of reading. I've read probably 200 of those articles so far, several book ethnographies as well. So, and coded them according to Ball and Margulis interdisciplinary themes, and some categories from a very recent review by someone called Ravid and colleagues, which is more on the psychological side. So the presentation itself is going to draw upon the codes of the review that related to things like compliance and resistance at the individual level, and negotiated order, so power and politics at the sort of organisational level of analysis. So now I'm going to move on to talk about platform work and what it is. So here is another lovely slide. So there's very little common. There are very few sort of accepted definitions of what platform work is, and in many ways the efforts of the Colleen project have been to try to describe it and define it in a comprehensive way. So generally speaking, you see on the left hand side of the slide there in the pale blue box, we've described platform work as short-term work which is paid on a per job or per task basis. And that work is contracted, executed and rewarded on a, for want of a better phrase, work allocation platform. And as part of the many reports that the project has done, they've tried to map out the shape of platform work as it currently exists in Europe. And in true business school style, they've done it in a 2x2 matrix. I mean, I couldn't be more proud. But I need to just take you through this matrix just so you kind of understand the dimensions of platform work as it's currently playing out. So if we start with that horizontal axis in the middle, you'll see that anything above that axis refers to platform work which is primarily done at a computer. So it's primarily a cognitive task done in an online way. And also that kind of work, it tends to be subcontracted by businesses to peers. So it's businesses using Upwork or Mechanical Turk or something like that to get a person to do a particular job for them. If you're beneath that horizontal line, you are looking at tasks which are more mobile and manual in nature. So being done by an embodied person going out in the world, doing things with other people. So, and that's more peer-to-peer. So we have different kind of platforms listed on that diagram, and I'll talk to you a bit more about those in a second. If we then look at the vertical axis on the 2x2, anything to the left of that is considered to be more low skilled work, so sort of more basic skills, and anything to the right of that central axis, that vertical axis, is mid to high skilled. So if we start with examples from, say, the bottom left-hand quadrant, so where we have platforms like TaskRabbit or Uber, what you're looking at here is a platform that allocates tasks or arbitrages tasks, which are to do with deliveries, errands, the ride-hail services and so on are all on that excuse me a minute, on that bottom left-hand quadrant. But if we move to the right, we're talking about higher skilled work. We're talking about interactive, embodied work mediated via a platform that's maybe to do with tutoring, music lessons, school subjects, something more interactive. And if we moved above the horizontal line again, the kind of work that's done on Mechanical Turk is quite interesting. If you can see the tagline, it's probably quite small on the screen there. But the tagline to Mechanical Turk is artificial intelligence. So Mechanical Turk is generally there for that last mile. So to get people to do things that the AI can't quite do yet. So people on Mechanical Turk are doing things like identifying objects in images, transcribing audio, editing reviews, responding to questionnaires, things that you need an actual human being to do. But if you move over to Upwork, that's more high skilled work that's brokered on a platform. So a really common thing on Upwork is video editing, voiceover work, website work, coding, that sort of thing. That's found on Upwork. Now, all of these platforms sell themselves to potential platform workers because by saying that they are they're flexible. So work on there is flexible, it's highly accessible, it enables you to be autonomous and fit it in with the rest of your life. And people do it for lots of different reasons. So say if you look at some of the work on Uber drivers, you'll find that quite a lot of those drivers are hobbyists. They're people who enjoy driving. They're people who enjoy the social aspect of being in a car with others and chatting to them. But then you get to the people who need it to top up income, who do it on a part-time basis, and then the people who need it all over the world because it's the only way that they can earn an income. And then when you get to these types of platform workers, you start to realize the stress and the precarity and the low control that they have over their working conditions. And that's when it becomes very, very difficult. And one of the things that the project has identified is that on many of these platforms, you have a problem called the superstar effect. Now, the superstar effect is sort of tantamount to the 80-20 problem. So you have 20% of the top performers doing 80% of the work. So you're wondering, you know, what else is, you know, who else is going to get the spoils or like the pickings from that. And I have to say, this is something that's affected me personally. You know, during the pandemic, my partner works in the events industry as a sound and lighting designer. He couldn't get work. He was made redundant. And this was one of the things we looked at to try and get some money. The same, my brother, a classical musician, totally no work. And him and his pals, they're all doing delivery driving now. So this is something that has, you know, affected a lot of people in the pandemic and has sort of contributed to that sense of precarity. But to return to this point about the 80-20 effect, some of the problems with getting access to platform work are to do with the way that work is allocated, and that is via an algorithm. So whether you're awarded a work contract or whether you're shown particular opportunities depends on things like your past performance and your customer rating. And if you've not done it before, then, you know, where do you start? So there's a lot of stories about people doing 2 to 3 months of unpaid work to establish their ratings, perhaps getting less money when you do get work. So having to commit quite a lot of time and energy to really making it worthwhile for them to do that work and to get the money from it. And there's actually very little influence over that process, because one of the rules on a platform is that you're an individual and you must do what the platform asks you. Going outside of that and reaching out to customers and trying to generate the customer relationship beyond that platform is very much frowned upon and could lead to your account being deactivated. Pay rates aren't sometimes that transparent. Platforms can even reject the work if it's deemed unsatisfactory and you don't get an explanation. So it wouldn't be like in a normal job where perhaps if your performance wasn't up to standard, you would have a conversation about your personal development or perhaps some training. It doesn't work that way. And occasionally if things go wrong, humans behind the platform, because there are humans in there like working on help desks and so on, are sometimes quite difficult to get hold of. And this is a regular story from eBay and Mechanical Turk and workers on those platforms, that it's very difficult to get problems resolved quickly. So there has been a negative flavour to what I've just said, and when you read around this, you realise that there's quite a lot of criticism historically as well, because, you know, the way that this platform works is quite unfavourably compared to sort of controversial junctures in the history of labour, such as the precarious work that befell builders and dockers in the early 1900s. They were queuing up at the gates for work and then were sent home if they weren't picked by the foreman. It's been unfavourably compared to things like domestic service work, homework in the pre-industrial era. And it's also seen as the, and that, you know, and all the class and gender and also the race aspects of that. And it's also seen as the latest version of outsourcing. So when business schools, early 90s, we were teaching Atkinson's flexible firm model, which is all about keeping your high value core functions in-house and outsourcing the less valuable ones, maybe overseas, maybe to kind of more temporary contracts. And this is the same, but it's on a per task basis. So unlike these historical examples, I think the main issue here that people talk about is the algorithmic control of the work. And those of us with surveillance sensibilities, your ears will be pricking up right now, because we'll be going, this is socially sorted work allocation. Ooh, I think maybe someone needs to mute their mic there, if that's okay. Thank you. So this is socially sorted work allocation, right? So it's totally surveillant. But as with all studies of surveillance, it's not sufficient just to say, that's surveillant, therefore it's bad. Like, what does this stuff do? How does it control? And there's been some really interesting work published in the management literature on algorithmic management, which tells us, and I'm going to move to that now. Now, what I'd like to highlight is this paper by Kellogg and colleagues. Kellogg and colleagues do a very, very thorough analysis of algorithmic control and suggest that algorithms control work in 6 ways. Now, again, I couldn't be prouder being a management scholar here, seeing the 6 R's that are leading this discussion. And if you're here from a business school, and I know that a couple of people are, because I recognise the names, you'll be laughing because we have 4 P's, 5 S's, 7 this, you know. Here we've got 6 R's. And so Kellogg argues that algorithms control work, first of all, by restricting behaviours. So actually very specifically circumscribing the range of behaviours which can be shown and performed via the platform. And within those tasks also recommends courses of action. So if you're sort of riding Uber or something else, you will always get little choice points where you have to tick and exactly what you're going to do next and why. On Deliveroo, if anyone's done Deliveroo riding, you'll know this as well. It's every single element of the task has to be swiped. So, you know, cycle to the restaurant, tick, waiting in the restaurant, tick, got the food, tick, riding to the address, tick. You know, it's very, very broken down, and the courses of action are very circumscribed. Of course, everything that's done on the platform is recorded, and that's, you know, de facto surveillance, and it's rated as well in real time. And the algorithm then, you know, it judges the quality of your work, it combines customer information and decides whether you can continue to work and can continue to get shown opportunities. So you can be readily replaced on a platform. And similarly, at the other end, if you're a really high performing person, you then find yourself in kind of a gamification, dopamine triggering scenario to get you to keep going. So those are the 6 R's, the almost control of the work process from start to finish by an algorithm, and by a surveillant algorithm. When I was reading this paper, I thought back to a paper that I read years ago when I was doing my PhD, and it's by Grant and Higgins. And it's there. I mean, that little box there is from Grant and Higgins, and the paper's called Managing Service Workers via Computer. And so it really dates it. But they produced a pervasiveness model of surveillance. And I remember looking at this model thinking, well, the one on the right-hand side, the pervasive model, no manager in their right mind would do that. It'd be so demotivating. But look at what they say is really pervasive surveillance, individually targeted, immediately data collected and fed back widely to the public. Well, lots of people can see your rating on a platform, and a platform which assigns and tracks tasks. So this is incredibly pervasive surveillance, and would be very difficult to cope with in a regular employment scenario, but it does exist in things like Amazon warehouses, so that model does exist now. But one of the things I really want to highlight here is that there's been a lovely phrase to kind of capture the information asymmetry that is present in platform working because of this very highly targeted algorithmic surveillance. And Kershaw et al., and they looked at eBay vendors. And they said this is essentially the isolation of the visibles by the coalition of the invisibles. So on the time you're on the platform, your actions are totally visible to an algorithm whose terms you don't know, with people behind it that you don't know. And that's kind of the scenario, really. So it sounds pretty calculative, it's pretty rational. How do people cope with it? Well, we have literature on this too, again published very, very recently. Now, Chan and Humphreys and other ethnographies and other sort of close qualitative papers say that workers develop what they call an algorithmic imaginary to cope with work on these platforms. So that involves maybe really trying to think of what it is you're actually dealing with, sort of palpating it a little bit, testing it a little bit to ensure that you kind of know your terms of engagement. And we can sort of split this into 2 phenomena, and people who know labour process theory, there'll be echoes of labour process theory in this, but that's a rabbit hole I'm not going down at this moment. But we see people really, you know, being careful in the way that they interact with the technical aspects of the platform. So we've got Bucher et al.'s paper here on the left-hand side of the slide in the bullet points. Now that paper is published in Organisation Studies, the journal, and it's called Pacifying the Algorithm, which is a lovely title. And they did an analysis of the Upwork forums. Now, remember, the Upwork is the highly skilled part of platform work, really. But the amount of regulation that's going on here in terms of what is put on the platform is really noteworthy. So they sort of analysed these forums, and they found, okay, well, you're not supposed to complain too publicly about the platform. You're not supposed to report too many problems. You know, don't rock the boat. Don't reach out to your clients too much. Have some communication with them, but don't like over egg it. And don't get angry. Don't show emotion. That's what the actual technical interaction had to be like that, because it will be flagged and picked up by the algorithm. If we then move over to Veen et al.'s work, now Veen and colleagues looked at Deliveroo and Uber Eats riders. Now, those people are actually quite easy to study. Well, not easy to study, but you can identify them quite easily, at least so you can find them to study. But they spent a lot of time looking at where the locations would be that would come up with the most lucrative contracts. So they hung out in those places. And Deliveroo is quite an interesting organisation because it actually has humans on the worker end who are more managerial like, or more manager like, more senior riders who induct the new riders, and perhaps also indicate to them what indicators are most relevant to managers. Because I said before, you know, Deliveroo, there's a lot of swiping going on, a lot of micromanagement going on, and some of that information they don't have time to process, so they know exactly which indicators to put people in touch with. And the point of that is to avoid account deactivation at all costs. Now, what then happens is that there's sort of norms circulating among platform workers, things that they know they should do and things they should do to behave to maximize their opportunities on the platform. So Brugiere, it's a French article, and she or he, can't remember, looks at Uber drivers, and the Uber drivers there know the ratings that the customers give, and so they will definitely allocate their discretionary efforts to the ones who are likely to give a good rating. Kershaw's work with eBay sellers says, well, actually, I'm not going to bother with those bad customers. I'm not going to bother with the ones that give bad ratings, so I'm going to actually block them. Gallier, again, some really super work, showed that there's also a lot of identity work that goes on with the Deliveroo riders they looked at. Now, often you'll hear, I mean, the Uber case has been circulating this week in Britain, but sorry, I'm getting a lot of people coming in. I'm getting a lot of alerts in the middle of my screen. I'm trying to look at my slide. Sorry. So Gallier highlights the identity work that's done by Deliveroo riders. Now, we hear a lot about these tech companies who think of themselves as sort of egalitarian entrepreneurs with unbiased algorithms that sort of distribute stuff evenly and fairly. There's a very strong identity work going on the side of the platforms. Well, Gallier found that the Deliveroo riders were doing the same. They were thinking of themselves as sports entrepreneurs. So people who perhaps adopted a really hyper meritocratic approach, like I'm the fastest, that's why I'm the best, and I'm a sports entrepreneur, I'm kind of this autonomous entrepreneurial type, in the same way that the platforms talk about themselves. Irani's work was with Mechanical Turk workers, finally, and they actually one of the very earliest studies of platform workers, and they established that actually a really strong norm was to hide a lot of the work that you really do, only display the actual interaction and keep your emotional and true material labour out of your discussions with the platform. So that is the algorithmic imaginary. That's how people cope with this thing. And interestingly, this is also found on research which looks at surveillance in standard workplaces. So accounts from different professions say that, well, my autonomy, my professional expertise, my knowledge somehow minimises the control I feel by surveillance. It relativizes its effects. So people like legal professionals, clinicians, managers, journalists, carers, and also I found one paper on sports umpires. You know, the whole like TMO, if you watch rugby, you'll know that sign means. That really, umpires feel that really undermines their autonomy. It was baseball umpires in this case, but yeah, so their professional knowledge really sort of counteracts that. And I wonder if that's a little bit of what's going on here, platform workers trying to develop practical and tacit knowledge to kind of push back against some of this algorithmic control. But another thing that they do is they find each other. So even though they're the isolated visibles, they find each other through online fora, through WhatsApp groups. And here is a lovely example, and surveillance scholars, you're going to really love this. the Turk Opticon. It's another Opticon. So the Turk Opticon essentially is a surveillance website. It's a worker-run review site of the people who request work on Mechanical Turk, or rather of the firms who request work on Mechanical Turk. So this is the point at which we start to move towards resistance. And I'm going to end this section with this quote from Shapiro. Now, I don't know how that's the page number. I mean, that must be a really massive journal, 2,968 pages. Anyway, so Shapiro says that control ultimately hinges on the worker's willingness to conform to the calculative rationalities that the companies, that's the platforms, project onto them. So workers reflect on the conditions of their work. They develop a sense of company strategies and tolerate them to the extent that they align with their own interests. And that is an absolutely crucial point: interest alignment. And that's because when we start to think about resistance, there's two really important things to note. The first of these is conflict of interests in the labour process, and this is absolutely central to how we understand resistance to emerge. And then with our resistance strategies, they exist on a continuum from individual action, individual sort of eking out agency, all the way up to collective action. So I'm going to move on to talk about resistance now and how we can sort of start to sort of unpack this. Now, in classic labour process theory, and apologies to those of you who know labour process theory, but in the classic labour process theory, there's the assumption that at the heart of the employment relationship is a conflict of interest, and that conflict of interest is between workers and the employer. And no matter which way you look at it, and there's again another massive rabbit hole you can go down here, it's never too far below the surface. So the conflict of interest, it's fairly intuitive. It stems from employers always wanting to drive down the costs of operating, and workers always wanting to have a living wage and decent terms and conditions, however you define these, or however you define these. And compromise is usually reached in the effort reward bargain, in the terms and conditions surrounding work, in the way that everyone treats each other. But the important thing to remember about the labour process and the employment relationship is that it's equitable treatment that really cements the consent in the labour process, and that's over whatever timescale, another rabbit hole, but it's equitable treatment. And in platform work, the control is calculatively rational, it's all-encompassing but narrow and intense over the period of which the job work is taking place. But then so are the ways in which people engage with the work short-term on a per-job basis, and there may be a less of a conflict of interest there for some people. So think of the hobbyists who perhaps do this for pleasure. Maybe that, that's all right with them, but not everybody. And the ethnographies of platform work show that the conflicts of interest arise when there's a growing sense of unfair treatment at the hands of the algorithm, and little way of remedy for that unfairness. So the coalition of the invisibles is bearing down and making your life very difficult. So an example of that with the ethnographies, Alex Rosenblatt's brilliant ethnography of Uber drivers. I don't know if some of you might use Uber. I live in the middle of nowhere, so I don't use Uber. But they have this thing called upfront pricing. So when customers name their price beforehand, drivers found out that they were being paid a standard rate that was often way below the upfront pricing, and Uber was taking the difference. And they found out by counter surveilling, they found out by having a customer version of the app open on a different phone on their laps in the car. So they lobbied for a tipping function in the app as a result of that. We also have Uber drivers very worried about their physical safety. So although, like, sort of ironically, they are very closely surveilled in the car, women Uber drivers who had sexual assaults or abuse, verbal abuse given to them by male passengers, found that Uber wasn't really bothered about their safety. They said, oh, we'll just won't allocate that rider to you next time. So that's hardly the point. How are you looking after me as I'm in my car with this person who may be abusive? If you talk to the hosting platform, so the Airbnb type people, they find it very frustrating that they can't challenge a customer rating if they felt it had been given unfairly and did not represent the experience. So they felt they had no voice. Mechanical Turk workers having accounts suspended and not knowing why, difficult to get it reinstated, and just meeting a wall of automatic replies. So this is all stemming from this algorithmic control and a sense of unfairness. And if we go back to Kellogg, oh, there we go. If we go back to Kellogg, they set out very clearly how the kind of dissatisfaction can stem from these 6 R's of the algorithmic control process. And if you look at some of the content on that on the slide there, with the task restriction and the recommended courses of action, we find, frustration, awareness of bias, reduced well-being, reduced voice, and precarity. And this is captured in some of the research I've cited there. The recording and narrating component, which is very surveillant, those things on that bullet point there, they totally align with the issues that have been captured in the regular workplace surveillance literature. So, loss of privacy, obviously, lack of ability to challenge, all those things. And finally, being replaced and rewarded differently. When I read that aspect of the paper, I was really reminded of a piece I read that was published in 1987, actually by an author called Niebecker. Was it Niebecker and Tatum, I think, and they spoke about how surveillance is way more stressful if you have more to lose or gain by being under surveillance, and that's exactly what is replicated. I think it really strongly resonates there. But ultimately, yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. There's one more thing I need to say about that. Actually, sorry. These are all very strongly distributive and procedural justice concerns as well. But when we think about the type of resistance that may result from that, again, we look to traditional labour process theory, and labour process theory says, well, there's a continuum of strategies. It ranges from workers eking out space for agency by bending the rules, perhaps by sabotaging a little bit, pilfering, those sorts of things, through things like using humour and cynicism and storytelling to kind of build up that sense of collective, collective conflict of interests, and then through that the establishment of shared interests, solidarity, collective action, and so on. And Kellogg argues that the same is true of resistance to platform work, and they call this algo activism. So there we have it, a strongly counter-surveillant flavour in the way that resistance materialises in this setting. And we start with, there we go, practical action, non-cooperation with the rules, perhaps speaking to customers more than you should do, setting kind of back channels with them, not accepting particular jobs because of various reasons. Like Uber drivers don't like to do pool rides and things like that. Registering on different ride-hailing platforms and gaming them against each other is another thing that they do, and that's captured in those references there. The next level is what we call platform action, so the use of fora such as Turkopticon or other ones to accomplish reverse surveillance on the platform. Setting up alternative platform cooperativism is a cooperatively owned platform. There's not a lot doing at the moment, largely because of the pandemic. But I think one of them's called, oh no, let me think. I can't remember the name of it. Just because I need to turn my page. Fairmondo, thank you notes. Fairmondo in Germany. But kind of individual actions on fora to get together, getting training, getting education, taking care of others, helping people get by collectively is the basis of collective action here. The next level is what we call discursive framing, so engaging in public critique, calling for professional codes of ethics for people who write algorithms. Some of us will be very familiar with that. And finally, legal mobilization, so the use of the transfer of disputes rather to arenas where we can actually use legal norms and rules to, rule on what's going on. So this week, Uber drivers in Britain have been recognised as employees, and that's what we're talking about here. And if you look at the two references there, Tassinari, Macaroni and Kant, those are both great ethnographies of the Deliveroo strikes in 2016 and 17, and they talk very clearly about how the trade union legislation and was actually utilised there, although they started as wildcat strikes, but they really got organised in the end. So that's resistance to algorithmic control. So what does this tell us about surveillance? Now, what I've been indicating so far, turning to the next slide here, is that this underlines a lot of what we know already. There's some very similar phenomenon going on, and this all stems from the fact that surveillance is primarily an organising process. It has been for the last 200 years nearly, and it does something in organisations in relation to employees, which is facilitates the employment contract. It facilitates the completion and the execution of that contract, and in both settings it's doing that. If it was an employment contract in platform work, the difference obviously in platform work is who's doing the surveillance. It's an algorithm by and large, which is backed on by an organisation and the people within it. And the other difference is the way in which it's balanced with other aspects of the employment relationship. And that's not the case in platform work. It's just this short-term burst, as opposed to having like a, performance appraisal framework around it, different policies around it, organisational culture and climate and ways of being in the organisation that somehow relativise surveillance, whereas here it's totally pervasive and it's not easily challenged or negotiated. We find that resistance follows a similar continuum, which begins, in this case, with counter-surveillance. And if you are a surveillance academic, you'll recognise a lot of phenomena in this. So you'll recognise, say, if we go back to Roy Boyne's paper in 2010, which said, well, panoptic and post-panoptic logics exist in tension and compete with each other. So we have, the fully visible worker, invisible surveiller, that's a panoptic logic. But we also have a post-panoptic logic, which is all about the simulation and keeping the simulation accurate and keeping the algorithms working well, and the person, the worker that's in there is just merely incidental to that. We could also identify things like a surveillant assemblage. We could identify digital enclosure. We could identify multi-surveillances, Winifred Poster's idea. And we could also identify what Graham Sewell and James Barker pointed out a long time ago, which is if we have a controversy in a workplace and there's surveillance, it can really, really intensify matters. But what's different? And I think what's different here is the way in which platform work challenges our a priori assumptions about surveillance in the workplace. So here is another bullet point. What are the a priori assumptions we make when we approach the question of surveillance in the workplace? And every paper I've ever read pretty much starts with this trope that workplace surveillance is all about employers wanting to see more and more. It's all about employers wanting to control more and more. It's all about employers wanting to get deep into the emotions of the worker, and this is something that the wearable people and the quantified self people say. I've said that. The meta-analyses say that. They say studies of surveillance now cover performance, which is what I did my PhD on 20 odd years ago, location and movement of workers, surveillance of thought, feeling and emotion. And that's not what we have in platform work, because it's just so reductionist. It's calculatively rational. So when we're looking at worker surveillance and platform work, our starting assumption has to be something else. And this is where I'm going on a big experiment here. It's a thought experiment, because based on what I've read, the starting assumption has to be that these are organisations that don't want to see the people who contract their work to them. They are reluctant surveillors because they don't want to be seen as employers in relation to these workers. They don't want to see the employment relationship at all. And not only that, they don't want to be seen as that employer by not only by workers, but by local authorities, by regulators, by trade unions and competitors. Workplace surveillance, as we know it, as we're familiar with it in surveillance studies, it's not the same thing here. There's a real reluctance going on, even though they're hyper-surveillant, simulationally surveillant organisations. Instead of surveillance, we almost have a surveillance, 1L, which is about how they perpetuate these information asymmetries. they have a superior ability to do this, to hide from the responsibilities of looking after workers, because actually with surveillance comes responsibility, and they obscure themselves from that. They make themselves opaque behind these sort of algorithmic and organizational structures. But of course, what that then means is that there's big gaps and there's big blind spots, and so alternatives and resistant thought and resistant strategies and collective organising can actually coagulate in those spaces. Obviously, that's a broad statement, but it's something that I highlighted a long time ago in a paper called Elements of Surveillance, and I've sort of reinforced it again in my paper on exposure and another paper after that, the overview paper. But this has been repeated in work which looked at particularly at the Deliveroo strikes. Callum Kant's work on the Deliveroo strikes, called The Union involved, which is the independent workers of the world, the invisible organisation. So we have the coalition of the invisibles, the invisible organisation. There's an invisibility trope here. There's also like this reluctance to surveil trope, which is interesting. So this then got me thinking about surveilled subjectivity. What's going on with the workers involved here? And I'm talking about my own concept again, which is exposure. And when I first started thinking about that concept, I was trying to capture the fact that in the regular workplace, we have these different registers of the subject, which are captured by surveillance in the workplace in what I called at the time a political economy of interiority. And there is that going on here as well, I think, but it's just not a very deep one. And Maria Laura Di Domenico and myself explored this this concept exposure in relation to a particular category of worker, and they were B&B owners who were trying to negotiate the presence of covert bed and breakfast inspections. You know, like, why is she talking about bed and breakfast? Well, think about it. Bed and breakfast owners are independent, home-based businesses, and a lot of platform workers are doing exactly that. And what we found in our study was that the prospect of exposure to covert surveillance drove resistance via counter-surveillance strategies, so stalking and outwitting the inspector, equipping oneself with the knowledge of the criteria and finding out about them, having this surveillance imaginary, a bit like the algorithmic imaginaries we discussed earlier. And what we outlined was that when the B&B owners were in control of their exposure in this service encounter to the not only the customer but also the inspector, that could be playful and empowering and thrilling. But when they weren't sure of the identity and what was going on with the surveillance, it was oppressive, anxiety provoking and fearful. And if we move over to platform work, we find echoes of that there as well. We find algorithmic imaginaries which tell us workers are working really hard to manage the way in which they're seen by the platform, so that algorithm is pacified and they're keeping their entire selves out of that effort reward bargain, that selective exposure. And we also see it's gamed. So there's elements of gamification with Uber drivers gaming platforms against each other, delivery riders thinking themselves of hyper meritocratic entrepreneurs, sports entrepreneurs, and also on Mechanical Turk we have evidence of people forming local teams. So, okay, we've not really gone beyond exposure then, except for the fact when I read this paper by Hafermaltz, again in organisation studies, and they argue that platform workers are in a quest for visibility. And that got me thinking about exposure, because I think there's a new quality of exposure going on here regarding recognition in front of reluctant surveillors that don't really want to see them. So, and I don't know if that's a thing, a reluctant surveillor, but we never think of surveillance in those terms, do we, in surveillance studies? So, we, you know, in terms of proper recognition of effort, them working to recognise the influence of the algorithmic surveillance, the platform's recognition of the depth of engagement required beyond the tasks that they're doing, and the platform's recognition of itself as an employer and the responsibilities that come with that. And it's that that's fueling that continuum of resistance, I think, in this setting, and I do think that's a bit different. So, the end. I'm going to conclude then. I want to conclude with this picture. I love this picture. It's a graphic artist who lives just down the road from me in Fife called Julie Campbell, and I bought this from her. This is so pedestrian, right? I bought it from her at this like Christmas craft market that they had in some village hall in Fife. And I couldn't believe I found this image. It's a kind of a robotized person wondering who and what they are. And this really captures my concern with platform working. But that said, I mean, I'm still reading about it, right? I've still got a lot to go. I've probably got another sort of 50 or 60 articles to read, and I've got to write the synthesis. There's also a lot that I haven't said about the structural inequalities of platform work. There's a load of other work going on platform work that looks at its intersection with, you know, global north versus global south, inclusivity and participation for marginalized groups, migration status, education status, all sorts of things going on. I need to acknowledge that that work's out there. It's not just about surveillance, the work that's going on at the moment. But I am interested to hear what you thought of those ideas. I've been working on my own with them alone for the last 3 months. I've not said them to anybody. And I wonder if this has caused you to rethink aspects of surveillance in the workplace or wider. So I'm going to end my talk there. I'm going to press stop presenting on the Teams interface here. I don't know what's going to happen. Oh, there we go. And I'm going to say thanks everyone for listening. Thanks for listening to me ramble on. Your time is so precious. So thank you for coming, and I look forward to your questions. So back to you, Rosamund, for the questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Kirstie. Okay, who has questions? Please put up your hand or write them in the chat. I'll start off with a question for you, Kirstie. In relation to the reluctant surveillors, I understand your observation, but I wonder if there's not part of the purpose of the platforms is to gather data from the workers, and if it's not that they're reluctant to surveil, but that the form of surveillance is just very different.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that occurred to me quite recently. I think the construction of the reluctant surveiller comes from the worker side, because of what I've read is but actually there's a lot I'm screening out. I feel that this needs to be recognised, and if you compare that to okay, I hesitate to say it, but a contract, an employment contract within an organisation, usually more of that would be taken account of and would be considered a responsibility or a co-responsibility of the employer and the employee in that setting. But we're not getting that in platform work. So that's what I mean by reluctant surveiller in relation to those workers. Clearly, these organisations are hyper surveillant and really interested in data and really interested in what they can do with data, and also how they're surveilling the customers as well. But I think there's a bit going on from the workers' point of view, in the sense that it's not recognised. You know, the work they're putting in is not recognised or compensated or in any way wanted, and that they seem to want to offer it up and say, "Look at all this stuff I'm doing that you're not accounting for." You know, so I think it's from the workers' side, but no, these are hyper surveillant organisations, but there's something going on with the subjectivity of the workers there that I wanted to pick up with that.
Okay, there's some things going on in the chat. So there's Cherik who is commenting, reluctant for now, but regulatory power is rendering them more clearly as a surveyor, slowly but surely. Not a question yet, more thought. Don't know if you want to respond to that.
Totally. And then you actually get into the Amazon scenario potentially, which is not a healthy one for people who work there at all.
Okay, question. In platform work, is there such a thing as not wanting to be visible? My own experience of being surveilled in the workplace at a bank was that we did not want to be seen, because if we were, that meant we had done something bad.
Yeah. So in platform work, is there such a thing as not wanting to be visible? Quite clearly there is, because when we looked at anticipatory compliance, work, you know, Bucher's work and all of that, that was about screening things out of the interaction with the platform. You know, it was about that. Be careful what you say. Be careful. Don't act in the incorrect way. So, you know, I think that resonates quite a lot with what the questioner just said. Is this going to be in the chat actually? I just want to maybe.
Yes.
Okay, I haven't got it up because I would find it a little distracting. But now I'm stopped talking. Yeah, and I think, you know, I think there's, in the study of workplace surveillance, we do see a lot of variation in the way that it is implemented. There's 50 years worth of research on this that, you know, talks about, you know, the importance of autonomy, the importance of you know, organizational citizenship behaviors, the importance of feedback frequency, the importance of management worker relationships. There's a whole ton of variation. It's really really difficult to generalize. But yeah, I mean, I can understand why you would, you know, if you're working in a bank, banks are very heavily surveilled because of the regulatory environment that they're in. What was the question again? Sorry. Is there such thing as not wanting to be visible? Absolutely, yes, there is. I mean, there's, you know, that's why we find resistance to surveillance. I mean, call centers again are the really interesting one. People kind of manipulating the call categories to actually eke some time back and sort of get some time away from the gaze. Yeah, this is all, you know, this is all very important.
I have another question in the chat. How do you see self-surveillance, peer surveillance, and employer surveillance interact?
So thank you for that question. I'm going to refer you to a paper by Graham Sewell that was written quite a while ago now. It was written in 1998, who talked about the chimerical, or I don't know how, is it chimera, CHIMER? How do you say it? I mean, I don't know how you say it. It's a chimerical model or chimerical model. I don't know. Anyway, that's what he talked about. He talked about within organizations, it's not actually appropriate to think about surveillance just in a hierarchical sense. Actually, that we have multiple directions in an organization. We have obviously the institutional hierarchical, but we also have peer surveillance in teams. The paper's called The Discipline of Teams. So yeah, that we have these multiple lines of sight in organizations. Self-surveillance is another really important aspect of that, and how we choose to present ourselves in the workplace. This also comes up in the platforms literature too. So I just refer you to that paper. It's excellent. The Discipline of Teams by Graham Sewell.
Okay, maybe Jarek, you want to?
Yeah, I can also. Hi. I can also ask the question. Hi, Kirstie. Thanks for your talk. I had to tune in half an hour later. Sorry for that, but I only tuned in a half. And I really like the idea of a reluctant surveillance. I was also thinking, of course, they don't want to hear about all the noise and the annoying things of the individual workers, but surely they have a role in as reputation engines and as network effects that they do need to monitor how well their platform is doing, right? So there must be some kind of maybe a reluctance towards the individual platform worker, but surely not towards their performance online, right?
Yeah, so one of the resistance strategies to do things that damages the reputation of the platform.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
I did pick that up somewhere, but to be honest, I've read so much that I can't remember where it was. But yeah, this is actually a resistance strategy to do things that will publicly damage.
So they will want to survey that, I guess, as a platform.
Yes. They'll need to maybe weed out the dodgy stuff. So Susanna has just left. Bye. Thanks so much for the feedback. There's also someone else I need to say hi to. Courtney Hagenford says thank you and hello from the CRISP Summer School WhatsApp group. I don't believe they're still going. Well done. Cool. Any more questions?
Oh, still people coming in.
Yes.
I think they might have thought 3 o'clock UK time, maybe.
Maybe.
I don't know.
Any other questions?
Obviously stunned silence. They're all thinking.
Yes. Although I thought there were some people in there actually. Just as I was thinking, Jason, who could maybe reflect on some things. Jason.
Oh, just a really quick question, and I unfortunately do have to go too. But thanks, Kirstie. And I see that there's another question as well. But mine is just, can we see some of the platformization logic happening in other areas? I'm thinking again of some of the projects that we're working on, which are, much more base level, line level workers that are having to deal with some of these same issues on a regular basis. And I'm curious if you had thoughts about how that ends up also overspilling into things that are slightly less automized, although some of that's also the process, and some of the things that we're dealing with here is thinking about how that's becoming a bit more automized.
You're absolutely correct. There is an overspill effect in terms of the platformation of regular work. It's part of the task I have to do for the project to actually assess that. I have read something about it. It's not at the forefront of my mind, but I've definitely observed it. I think one of the big elements is gamification, that kind of dopamine triggering of commitment on that kind of micro level. I mean, some of the best cases I've seen, the best case analysis I've seen are of the Amazon, of the Amazon, like the rank and yank, like what they call the rank and yank system of management in Amazon, and the almost full automation of the warehouses, and the really heavily gamified aspects of the warehouses. Also retail. I think retail is another area that's becoming more platformized, particularly around things like 0 hours contracts and shift working, that sort of thing. But I can't fully bring to mind a comprehensive answer to that question. I do know it exists, and I definitely know that it's part of the work I've got to do. So oh yeah, healthcare, home care, someone there. Home care. Was that you? Yeah, totally.
And
totally,
on our end, we're talking about the construction industry is also doing this more. That's what we're thinking about. So
perfect.
Okay, more discussion there, but thanks.
Yeah, definitely. I think Oliver's got a question.
Yes, hi Kirstie, thank you. Thanks for a very interesting talk on a Friday afternoon. It's a great way to sort of slip into the weekend.
For you, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So I have a question. I'm not sure if it's relevant or if it's something you've had a chance to really give any thought to, but when you were talking about this idea of reluctant surveillance, it started to make me think about, if there's any sort of new privacy implications or privacy considerations of this sort of new form of surveillance that you're talking about. I was just wondering if that's something you've come across in your reading while doing this literature review. Like I said, it may not be. I was just curious though if you'd...
Privacy itself?
Yeah.
Okay, so short answer, yes. I've pulled out some stuff on sort of privacy implications. Not read it yet.
Okay. Okay, fair enough.
But I mean, if we look back over workplace surveillance research on that, we know very clearly that workers have strongly held boundaries within which they will accept a certain amount of monitoring, but beyond which is really quite not acceptable. We also have I've read some things about workers inhabiting different visibility regimes inside and outside work and how they manage the boundaries between those. So it tends to lend itself quite a lot to the more sort of privacy to social value literature, and what's considered okay to share within the workplace and not, and what that represents and in terms of values and so on. So watch this space. I'll be on it. I'll let you know.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
I've got a question here. There's a question here from in the chat. It's a long one from Michelle. Shouldn't the debate be more integrated with experts in the field of computer engineering? Yes, it should. Yes, I read something the other day which actually concluded, like, the people we need to be talking about ethically, and actually I mentioned this. It's Kellogg's paper. They talk about actually developing codes of ethics for those people working with algorithms, and also understanding the compliance resistance tendencies within these different groups of algorithmic workers. This, I think, is the important next step to make, because I know that in the legal field and the socio-legal field, we've been focusing on data justice, and we've been focusing on those kind of case studies, but it's these people, these people are a very, very interesting group, And absolutely, algorithms are socio-technical in nature. I totally agree with you there. So yes, thank you for that question. And I do have some reading suggestions, but I can get in touch. So email me, Michelle. Thank you.
There's another question in the chat. Is
Okay,
there
sorry.
typology of types of algorithmic systems being used in reluctant surveillance platforms?
I don't know, Turk. I don't know.
Because I'm really looking at, in a lot of cases that we do, that there's anecdotal case studies that are very interesting, and you find out about one, and we do that mainly in the public sector, to really talk with data scientists and experts and scientists to really discuss labels and that go into this kind of algorithms. But it's very hard to find an overview of what kind of data sets combined with what types of algorithms are actually making for particular harms, right? So it would be interesting to have, or at least for me personally, I'm looking for a bit more grip on what is actually, what do these systems comprise of, what kind of models are used, and that is something that, for me at least, is missing to fill in that gap of where actually that harm takes place and what you can do, etc. So I was wondering if you came across anyone who made some kind of systematic of, this is just a simple algorithm, or this is very something that we cannot explain, etc. If there's any kind of level analysis there. As a sideline.
So no, but the short answer, right? So there's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is no, I haven't, but my colleague Tristan Henderson has at St Andrews. The other answer, I think, is a little bit more of a sort of a soul-searching question about surveillance studies, because I think that as a discipline, I don't think we can answer that. I think, critical code studies, critical data studies perhaps have more of a sense of those kind of technical questions. And I think this is where surveillance studies is actually at its limit in the likes of people like me who aren't or not that technical, trying to get their heads around it. Whereas, in these up and coming fields, they're way more interesting and exciting and actually can answer these questions. So personally, I think we should be having a dialogue around that. Yeah.
Agreed. Thanks.
Oh, new message. Okay. Any more questions?
Questions?
There's one more in the chat. Or not. I don't know.
Yes.
Maybe it's me.
Simona.
My question is a bit off topic, as my primary interest in the surveillance studies applies to surveillance transformations in the pandemic context. Will there be a seminar in the future? There's not one planned yet, but it could be. There could be one.
I mean, the obvious intersection with this topic is remote work.
Yeah.
So if you just go on Web of Science or Scopus and put in remote work, then you'll get a lot of references back about working from home and particularly sort of surveillance and screening out the background nightmare that's going on in the home. So
Kirstie, you mentioned this a bit in the beginning, but have you seen any research being done on that there is a clear increase in people doing these kinds of jobs as the result of the pandemic?
So this is the current survey of Kaleem. This is the current survey, the extent at which in the last year there have been an extension in platform work. But anecdotally and personally, I know that I know a ton of classical musicians who are currently working as delivery drivers, and that kind of thing. But in terms of research, I know that the next survey is on this. So it's something to be, it's something that, it's still ongoing, isn't it? So it's at what point do you dive in with that survey to get the best picture?
Yeah, but I guess that survey is UK focused.
Europe wide.
It is Europe wide. Okay.
Yeah, Europe wide, which doesn't include us anymore, does it?
No.
Sorry, bit of politics. Any more?
Okay, I suggest we if there's no final question, we'll leave it at that. And I want to thank you so much, Kirstie, for joining us. And I want to thank everyone who joined the seminar. And we'll have another event on the 22nd of April, which is a book launch of the book, The Algorithmic Society. So I hope to see some of you there. So thank you, Kirstie, and I hope to see many of you at future events.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thank
you. Bye. I'm just going to wave at everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Still waving. Someone's just turned up. Who have we got left? Oh.
Okay, that was great, Kirstie.